pleasure to be here tonight. I know San Diego fairly well. I'm in and out of the city on various errands. I wrote about San Diego and Tijuana in the mid-1980s for Harper's Magazine at a time when I think the Chamber of Commerce told me that 1 in 3 people in San Diego had never been to Mexico. I don't know whether that's changed, but here I am to talk about the color brown, and no city in America seems to me browner at this moment in history than San Diego, Tijuana, this strange set of brothers that finds itself neighbors and alter egos. I've come to you today to talk to you about brown. It is true that this is the last evening, I think, in which I will speak about brown. So I am both exhausted but also thrilled to be letting brown go. In some sense, I've lived with brown now for about 9 years, and it is not a good idea to spend 9 years thinking about a single color, because you come to auditoriums like this one and you look immediately for anything that is brown. Anybody who's wearing a brown sweater or a brown scarf, I'm immediately grateful and feel a kinship to you. The thing about brown that interested me in working on this book was that brown is the most impure color. It is not a singular color. My UPS man is brown, but what makes him brown? Well, several things that make him brown. He looks like The Rock, the professional wrestler. I think he's African American and Samoan, maybe Filipino. But what makes him really brown is that he has blue hair. The crust of the earth is brown. Human waste is brown, which embarrasses every morning because it reminds us, as Genesis tells us, that we are destined to turn into mud ourselves. Eve's apple, after she had taken a bite of it and realized what she had done after she had offered it to Adam, Eve's apple, after they threw it away in the garden, quickly turned brown, all things brown in time. It was the little blasphemy of the Polish Pope to clean the Sistine Chapel, to clean the brown from the Sistine Chapel. The ceiling had grown brown with time. Michelangelo's great vision of the beginning and the end, the Alpha and the Omega, the creation and the judgment had grown brown with time. And it was the little blasphemy of the Polish Pope to clean brown from our view of history, as though such a thing is possible. And with the assistance of a Japanese corporation, the Japanese being the last race in the world to believe in the efficacy of soap and water, the Sistine Chapel was cleaned. It took thousands of daubs of cotton swabs, several years to clean Michelangelo's great vision of time. All those layers of brown that had accumulated from votive candles and tourists and Roman summers and choirs singing. And little by little, the brown was removed like a veil. But I am here to tell you tonight that 4 years after the Sistine Chapel was cleaned, it is again turning brown. It was my agent, very elegant, Georges Borchardt, who was having lunch with me at a French restaurant that is now closed in New York. It was closed because it was engaged in a money laundering scheme for the mafia. And we were having lunch, and my agent suggested that I write a book about Hispanics in America. Who are they? At that moment, I was watching a waiter bring us our dessert, and I was trying to determine whether our waiter was Moroccan or Puerto Rican. Anyway, I decided that maybe that wasn't a bad idea. Georges Borchardt also suggested to Jane Fonda that she write an exercise book. So I began writing a book about Hispanics. But I got bored writing about Hispanics. For one thing, no one in Latin America has ever seen one. I have been to Bolivia, I've been to Chile, I've been to Mexico, I've been to Venezuela. I have been looking for a Hispanic everywhere in Latin America. And people there will tell you, there are no Hispanics here, senor. They will tell you, if you want to go see a Hispanic, you should go to La Jolla. There's one speaking this evening. I got bored with writing about Hispanics, and instead I began to wonder, why is it that most Americans, or many Americans, imagine Hispanics to be brown? We are, in fact, people of all races. We have blonde Hispanics and black Hispanics and Asian Hispanics and mixed race Hispanics, as I am. But in the popular American imagination, I think we represent some new, heretofore unknown brown race. Why? Which got me thinking about the color brown. Alexander Thoreau has a wonderful series of books about the primary colors, the colors that artists call pure colors, like red and like yellow. Brown is not a primary color. And Thoreau writes about the secondary colors, like purple, colors created by tube blending. Brown is not a secondary color. Brown is closer to a tertiary color. You need 3 or 4 or 5 colors combining to create a dark, rich shade of brown. I always say that the best example of brown in my life was the day that I left a box of Crayolas in the summer sun in Sacramento, California. I'd forgotten them in the summer sun, big deal. And my mother went out into the garden to hang the wash on the lines, and she stepped on the box of Crayolas. She looked under her foot and she thought it was something the dog had left. That was brown. When I tell you that America is browning, I'm speaking of that. I'm not speaking of Richard Rodriguez Hispanic. I am thinking of Richard Rodriguez American. The moment at which I come into contact with you and with you, I begin to brown. You brown me as I brown you. I think of myself otherwise in solitude. Richard Rodriguez Hispanic is orange. In a paint shop, I would be described as Aztec orange. A little paint sample would be described as Aztec orange, suitable for patios and barbecues. May I digress for a moment? There is always someone, some earnest creative writing student who will come up after one of my speeches and will say to me, even though all I write are essays, will say to me, have you ever tried writing a novel? I think the student means it as flattery. Or the student will say, have you ever tried writing poetry? No, I say, I'm an essayist. I write essays. I don't know how to write poetry. I don't know how to stop a line midstream and jump to the next line. I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to leave so much white space on the page. And I don't know how to write a novel. I don't know how to do that. I can't even, if you ask me for directions, I couldn't even get you to Highway 5, much less get a character across a lifetime. I'm an essayist. And for me, an essay is what I call the autobiography of an idea. I trace an idea through time. As a boy, I served at many funerals as a young boy. I grew up in an Irish Catholic church, and there were many funerals indeed, and I was always available to serve at these funerals. So I listened a great deal to pastors, Irish pastors, give the standard set speech at funerals. And I remember the Irish pastor saying, all of us will die. That's an idea. Richard Rodriguez put that idea in his pocket, and then several years later, his grandmother died, and he pulled out the idea and read it, and already the idea was beginning to change, was shimmering. And then several years later, one of his friends in high school named Danny, who'd become a policeman, had his face blown off one night in the 1960s in his patrol car. And I remember sitting at his funeral, listening to a tenor sing Danny Boy, and I pulled out the same idea which had changed, all of us will die. What I'm suggesting to you is that ideas live with us over time. There is wisdom in this room. There is wisdom in you that you do not know of because time has not revealed it to you. But it sits with you. And in time, you will realize as old men and women how much you knew as little boys and girls when you were 8 and 9 years old. Anyway, there I was in the 1950s in Sacramento, California. It was a black and white country, the country I grew up in. There was a tragic dialectic between Africa and Europe, and that was America. And there was a little boy in the schoolyard at Sacred Heart School named Buddy who had flaming red hair. And as long as there are kids like Buddy in the world, I will never believe in Santa Claus. Buddy is the kind of kid who put razor blades in bars of soap and then waits at the edge of the bathroom to see who will rub their hands with the bar of soap. He came up to me out of nothing that I had said, out of nothing that he had said, nothing that had been exchanged. Buddy came up to me and said, his chin on my shoulder, his mouth against my ear as a lover. He said to me, when you're white, you're all right. When you're black, stand back. When you're brown, stick around. I did what I was told. I've always done what I was told. I've been sticking around. I want to be clear tonight and say to you clearly that my brown was never an oppression in Sacramento. It was rather a kind of permission. I was profoundly irrelevant in the Sacramento of the 1950s, but I had permission to stick around. I remember in the 1960s when Malcolm X came to Sacramento, I decided that I wanted to go hear Malcolm X. I was interested in Malcolm X. I was interested in his anger. Didn't sound anything like the stoic Protestantism of Martin Luther King Jr. I didn't know at that time, I was about 15 or 16, I didn't know at that time that Malcolm normally restricted his audiences to African Americans. I remember coming into a hall much less glamorous than this one. There were two men, two thugs, standing at the door back there. One of them looked like Sonny Liston, the other looked like Mike Tyson. And I remember they both looked at me as I walked in that hall, mainly of black men. And I can still see their eyes, the calculation behind their eyes as to whether or not I should be allowed to enter, and they let me in. Brown was a kind of permission. I could go where I would. No one asked why. The only problem, the only burden, was that I was irrelevant. I remember Lyndon Johnson, who was the last black and white president in the United States. There had been a riot in a ghetto of Chicago, or maybe it was Cicero, Illinois. Lyndon Johnson, our last black and white president, did what all good liberals do when African Americans are angry. He forms a committee to find out why. We have to form a committee after all of these hundreds of years to find out why African Americans might be angry. The commission was called the Kerner Commission. And they found the conclusion of the Kerner Commission. I remember it portentously announced on the evening news that America was dividing in half. That's a new idea. One side black, the other side white. It was the first time, I think, I really felt this anger welling within me. This anger of my irrelevance in this room. I wanted this microphone. I wanted to be here. I wanted to speak of America, my America. Most African Americans are denied the color brown. They have been denied the color brown by the OneDrop Theory. The OneDrop Theory is that if you have one drop of African blood, you are black, no matter how light your skin or straight your hair. The OneDrop Theory still governs the way many African Americans who are lighter in shades of brown than I am will nonetheless still call themselves brown. Listen, I like the Academy Awards just as much as you do. I like it especially when the cutthroats give each other humanitarian awards. But last year, the cutthroats in Beverly Hills had even more reason to be self-congratulatory. They gave an actress named Halle Berry an Academy Award. And she came down the aisle of the Kodak Theater. She came to this podium. The screen split in half, and we saw her white mother weeping with joy at her daughter's success. And Halle Berry described herself as a black actress. And I thought to myself, even in the year 2002, even in Los Angeles, where everything otherwise is sexually possible, it is still too difficult to say, I am brown. I've come to San Diego tonight to say, on the last day of April, I am brown. And may I say something about whiteness. I have met very few white people in this country. Bill Clinton was one of the whitest persons I've ever met, and even Bill Clinton told me he's 1/16th American Indian. I sure would like to meet that grandmother. I've met people who are pink, people who are freckled, people who are yellow, people who turn gold in the sun, people who turn brown in the sun. But invariably after, and I say this to you, those of you who are parents in this room, I had been to many high schools and colleges in this country during Diversity Week when I'm asked to play the role of the Canadian. And invariably, a kid will come up to me afterwards. It may be your son. It may be your daughter. And she will say, I'm white. I'm nothing. Or I'm white. I have no culture. It is like Melville's whale. It is like this whiteness which is the absence of substance. And it is terrible. And you wonder why so-called white kids are enthralled by black culture. You wonder why. They want hip-hop. You wonder why my friend Rashad, who is in prison tonight, teenager, African-American, about 19, Rashad says, you know, whatever I do, Rashad wants to be a rapster one day. He said, no matter what I do, the white kids will steal it. I wear my baseball hat on backwards, they'll take it. If I wear it sideways, they'll take it. Rashad has taken to wearing turbans now, and he said, just watch. I was on a talk show in Washington, D.C., making fun of Canada. More about Canada in a minute. But there I was talking about Canadian multiculturalism. That's where we got the idea, by the way, from Canada. You were drinking this bottle of Canadian water. You thought it was pure, unlike Mexican water. You thought you could drink and drink and drink this Canadian water and that it would do you no harm, but there was a little virus in it called multiculturalism, and all of you have turned into Canadians. Anyway, I was on this talk show, and this woman called up and she said, you know, it is all well and good for you to make fun of Canadian multiculturalism, but when I was in Canada, I had a culture. I was Norwegian. I had my sardines, I had my grandmother with an accent, I had something. I come to America and I become white. I have nothing. You know, the oddest thing about America, if you are the son of immigrants, the oddest thing about America, and also the most brilliant thing, is that America presents itself not as a sensual experience, not as a physical experience, but as an intellectual experience. America is a set of ideas. The Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the Federalist Papers. If you can claim these, if you can embrace these, you are an American. We share no common blood. We say we share a common belief in ideas. It is an extraordinary thing to be an American, to believe in ideas. But I tell you, there is something close to what I would call the five senses of America. America has a smell to it. America has a look to it. A kid I know who came to the United States from Cuba in the Mariel boat exodus from Fidel Castro's nightmarish Cuba. The kid said to me, he said, you know, for the first few weeks I was in Tampa, Florida, America had this smell of pine sol. It was so strong. You smelled it in grocery stores and in churches, and then it disappeared. A few years ago, I was a judge for the National Book Awards. One of the reasons we always give the National Book Awards to the most tedious, the most obvious, the most unenlightened, the most unoriginal book is because we have to read in the course of 6 weeks 900 books. Anyway, I remember this book by a Chinese American who describes his journey to the United States. I don't know what the book was. I don't know who the author was. He was one of the 900. But I remember in the very early part of that book, he describes coming to America. And the smell of America is the smell of cut grass. And it stayed with him for about 5 weeks. And then it disappeared. And I think to myself, why didn't the Irish nuns, why didn't Thomas Jefferson, doesn't anyone ever talk of the smell of America? Or how in a few minutes you will all get up in this auditorium, you will all walk out of this room, I don't care what your race is or your ethnicity, you all walk with the same damn American slouch. It is what we say about you behind your back, that you are beginning to look like your dog. You walk your dog every night, you are beginning to look like your dog. Even more remarkable, your dog is beginning to look like you. Should it be any surprise that Americans begin to look like one another? Anyway, America is a series of ideas, we say. We say to the boy. I remember at Sacred Heart School in Sacramento, California, toward Thanksgiving time, there was a mimeograph cartooned color. It was the first Thanksgiving, the Indians having Thanksgiving dinner with the Pilgrims. There wasn't much to color when it came to the Pilgrims. They were all dressed in black, and they had these straight lines for mouths. The Indians were wonderful. The Indians came almost in mockery of the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims, the Puritans in England, had tried to close the playhouses down. That which is in us, which is most Puritan, is afraid of the theatrical, is afraid of blue hair, is afraid of inauthenticity, is afraid of the person who is not himself. There the Indians came dressed for Halloween to Thanksgiving dinner. The Indian princess looked like Olivia de Havilland. There was lots to color, her feathers, the paint on her face. At the end of the dinner, the last thing we see of the Indians, they are going into the forest looking for Pepto-Bismol. But no one falls in love. No one even flirts. No one exchanges email addresses. No one asks of star signs. No one winks. No one is curious. No one glances again just before they disappear into the forest. No one falls in love in the American story. No one ever falls in love in the American story. We give our children history books that are filled with stories of conflict, battles, division. And we cannot explain how it is. We cannot even explain who they were, those brown children at Monticello, playing behind the great house. We give Pulitzer Prizes to these dreadful historians with bow ties from University of Virginia and Yale University. We give them gold medals, but they never tell us who the brown children were behind Monticello. I want my money back. There is no story of love, illicit or not, in America. The only people who really know the story of America, the true history of America, the people who should get the Pulitzer Prizes, are the grandmothers who sit in kitchens and know all about America, the stories that are never told, the family secrets. I loathe Mexico. I loathe Mexico with a kind of physical disdain. I loathe upper-class Mexico. I have been in upper-class Mexico's company. I describe a scene in Brown where I'm sitting in Lomas at Chapultepec in Mexico City with these white Mexicans. And we are doing what rich Mexicans always do when they are together. We are speaking of France. And there we are in the capital of peroxide. And I'm talking to one of the members of the family that owns Televisa, Peroxide Incorporated. Televisa is the major broadcasting voice of Mexico. It sends blonde romance to the entire world. I'm sitting next to this very charming young old man who is telling me about hotels he and his wife knows in France. The Negresco Hotel was it in Nice or Deauville? Have you been there, he says. No, I've not been to the Negresco. Wonderful hotel. Silk sheets. Of course, my wife and I, we were married there. They know us well, and we go back every year, he says. He is eating his salmon. He has teeth like a chipmunk. And then in the middle of the conversation, he says, by the way, who are you? And I say, I'm a writer. I've come to Mexico for a conference sponsored by the great voice of Mexico, Octavio Paz. A writer, un escritor. Ah. And then he says to me, what only Mexico can say to me. He says, you know, in Mexico we don't have writers who look like you. What I loathe about Mexico is its fear of its own face. What I love about Mexico is its sexual candor. Nobody falls in love at that Thanksgiving Day in New England. But in Mexico, Mexico tells the story of her birth as a story of rape, sweating bodies. He moaned, she groaned. 9 months later, the baby was born. The mestizo was born. There is an erotic candor in Latin America that is nowhere in the United States. This description of love and lovemaking and rape and seduction. In Brazilian Portuguese, there are over 300 words for brown. If papi is this, and mommy is this, then baby is this. In 18th century Mexico, there was an artistic tradition called las castas, where Mexican men and women of various hues would be pictured with their child who was of different hue. And behind them would be parrots and pineapples, evidence of the New World, because the Mexican preoccupation, even then in the 18th century, was with the idea that we were creating children on this side of the ocean who were unprecedented in history. My friend Michael is a fireman in San Francisco. My friend Michael is a robust fireman in San Francisco. My friend Michael is about 42 years old. He drives a Volvo, and he drives like an old lady. We are late for the movie. He is going 20 miles an hour. He stops at every intersection and looks 4 ways, even on one-way streets. I say, Michael, we're late for the movie. My friend Michael says to me what every African-American friend of mine has said somewhere in the course of our friendship. By the way, do you know that I'm part Indian, Cherokee, Mohican, Choctaw, Algonquin, Plains Indian? No, I didn't know, Michael. Which chapter of the American history book is that? The love story of the Indian and the African in the New World is one of the epic romances of this adventure we call the New World. It is nowhere in our history books. So then I say to my friend Michael, well, then you're not black, Michael. And he said, what do you mean I'm not black? I said, you're part Indian. He said, I am black, he said. As long as the white cop sees black when he looks at me, I am black. And I say to Michael, you know, in Mexico we have a name for you. In the 17th century, the Indian, tired of doing the Europeans' work, do it yourself, she said. You want the gold? Here's a shovel. He was in his silks and his velvets. He could not touch the shovel. So he decided to import Africa to do the work the Indian would not do. Africa came to Mexico. It was the agreement of the civic government and the church that the children of African Indian birth would be born free, which perhaps accounts for why he married her. But what did she see in him? His beauty, his defiance, his resilience. Within a generation, the African population of Mexico begins to melt into the Indian. All things melt in time. It's not what I've come here tonight to tell you. The African impregnated the Indian, and released from her Asian secret. She came from the other side of the Pacific. The children were born looking Asian. Mexico calls the children of African Indian birth in the 17th century chinos. I've come here tonight to tell you, in San Diego, that the world is round as Columbus imagined, and sooner or later we are all going to end up looking like Keanu Reeves. His mother is Anglo-Canadian, his father is Hawaiian Chinese. We are all going to end up looking like Keanu Reeves, and everything will taste like chicken. And then my Mexican aunt married my uncle from India, from Bombay. And then I remember there was a Hindu Christmas every year, turbans at Christmas. And I remember Dr. Gupta, his sister, used to stretch out her hands over the turkey, and the turkey did not flinch. Very brown indeed, a Hindu Christmas. You wonder why I'm so mixed up. I was educated by the Irish. My uncle comes from India. My father made false teeth for Chinese dentists. I have been to more Chinese weddings than anyone else in this room. You wonder why I'm mixed up. You wonder why I am brown. And then a blonde lady starts showing up at the Hindu Christmas. She sits over there, this blonde lady. She has this cup of coffee on her lap. She's very demure. She looks like the Clairol lady. Her hair is so blonde, it's almost white. It's ash blonde, I think they call it. Who is the blonde lady? I can deal with the sombreros, I can deal with the turbans, but who in the hell is the blonde lady? We are driving home. It is Christmas night. My mother is tired. I'm in the back seat. I am blowing against the window of the back seat. I am watching my breath form a cloud on the window. I am playing with that cloud, drawing circle within circle. Who is the blonde lady? Why does she come every year? My mother is tired. What do you want to know? Why does she come? Her name is Ruth, my mother says. She met your uncle's Krishna. She met Krishna's nephew at Berkeley. They were law students together. They fell in love. That's what I wanted to know. They fell in love. That phrase just hung in the air. They fell in love. One of the reasons I think I have been so preoccupied by these themes is because even then, at the time in which I was asking questions about the blonde lady, I knew that I was a queer little boy, and there was nothing more dangerous for me to do in an auditorium like this than to tell you that I have the wrong kind of love. But I was always interested in that theme in America. And I remember I must have been 8 or 9 years old, and I was in Sacramento, California, and I saw this black man walk down the street with a blonde woman, and I was petrified. I wanted to go up and put my arms around him and tell him to take care. It is dangerous to fall in love in America. And now there is some horrible event in South Carolina. A black Baptist church will be burned to the ground, where some Nazi obscenity will be scrawled on a New Jersey synagogue. Or a mosque in Chicago will be torched, and the priests and the rabbis and the mullahs and the ministers will link arms on the 6 o'clock news and talk of hate crimes, how we are united against hate crimes. And I think to myself, where were you all those years in America when men were hung in this country for the mere offense of looking at her? We put a noose around his neck, and we hung him from a tree until his mouth gaped open and his eyes were empty. Where were you? Where were you when Matthew Shepard was hung out to dry on a fence in Wyoming? Hate crimes. 1972 is oddly important in my imagination. That was the year that Pierre Elliott Trudeau in Canada invented multiculturalism, but that was the year in the United States that Richard Nixon invented the Hispanic. I owe my existence to Richard Nixon. One of my favorite chapters in Brown is a chapter called Poor Richard, which is about Benjamin Franklin, Richard Nixon, and professional wrestling. In 1972, just about the time when most Americans were buying color television sets and the war in Vietnam had moved to Cambodia and had turned from black and white to lime green, and blood had turned from black to red on our television sets. Just about that time, Richard Nixon decided that America was no longer a black and white country. I do not know why exactly Richard Nixon came to that conclusion. That is, I think it sometimes, when I think of Dark Nixon, that he was trying to undercut the black civil rights movement, the Negro civil rights movement of the South, the Stoic Protestantism of the South had moved north, was transforming itself into a secular anger. Young African Americans were renaming themselves no longer Negro, but black and angry. And Richard Nixon, perhaps to undercut them, said, you know, you're not the only Coca-Cola in the desert. Richard Nixon knew that America was not merely a dialectic between Africa and Europe. Richard Nixon said, we are five, a Pentagon. We can be white, black, these are the categories of affirmative action we've been using for 30 years. White, black, Asian/Pacific Islander, American Indian/Eskimo, or fifth, Hispanic. The best thing about Richard Nixon's Pentagon is that it suggested roundness, something of Columbus, something of a global society, that we were not simply a dialectic, a straight line, we were a round idea. The bad thing about Richard Nixon's five is that he established categories of our separation, which have lasted and have been strong for over 3 decades. What was also wrong with Richard Nixon's categories was that it created this false flattery about Hispanics. We began to be numbered in the 1980s. The Coors Beer put up billboards throughout the Southwest. Coors Beer salutes the decade of the Hispanic. Burp. And then the Census Bureau began to announce in the early 1980s that Hispanics were destined to replace. That was the verb the Census Bureau used then and has used in the years since. Replace African Americans as the country's largest minority. It is a malicious verb. And to any African American in this room tonight, I say, I'm sorry. I should have spoken up earlier. I should have said this earlier in New York and Chicago and San Diego and San Francisco. I should have said clearly into a microphone, I do not replace African Americans. I don't know what that verb means. I walk in the room, they leave. They are at the very center of my imagination of what it means to be an American. I think of myself in Sacramento, California in the 1950s, watching the Negro Civil Rights Movement every night on television, on the small black and white television, knowing even then that their story, this determination of a people who had been humiliated in every way to stand upright, that somehow their story implicated all of us, was the Central American story. I do not replace these people, and I apologize to them. We do not replace you, partly also because many of us are black. Many Hispanics are black. There is no race called Hispanic. Many of us are black. We cannot replace ourselves. The only sexy thing about being Hispanic is that since we are not a race, we are a culture, or the illusion of culture, cultura. Hispanics are united by this idea of culture. And the only good thing about a culture is that I can give it to you. I can't give you my blood, but I can give you my culture. I can cook it for you. We can dance my culture. I can sing my culture. I can teach it to you. Here, take it. I have said on more than one occasion that the only Hispanics I know in Los Angeles, the only true Hispanics, are the rich kids of Beverly Hills who have Mexican and Guatemalan nannies, who have taught them the recipes and the prayers and the songs, and they have become Hispanic. Whereas Richard Rodriguez, becoming Irish and Indian and Chinese. In the old black and white America, you could not be both. You had to choose one parent or the other. And now there are people, prominent African Americans, who are speaking brownly about themselves. Tiger Woods says, "I'm not black." To say that I am black would dishonor my mother from Thailand. I am African. I am Thai. I am white. Colin Powell says, our Secretary of State says, I'm African. I'm Caribbean Indian. I'm Scots-Irish. Imagine the story of America if we really told it as grandmothers know it. These marriages that have occurred in this country that we know nothing of. I am Scots-Irish, Colin Powell says, and I'm Anglo-Saxon. And Barbara Walters said, well, that's nice, dear, but what does it feel like to be the first black Secretary of State? And now I meet them in Kansas, I meet them in New Jersey, I meet these kids who tell me they are Laotian Germans, or the kids in LA who call themselves Blaxicans, or the guy comes up to me in Baltimore, Maryland and says, I'm Jewish and my wife is Indian. The kids call themselves Hindus. What's really interesting about being a Hindu is that it suggests that something else is going on, and it is not simply racial. But kids are not choosing between their parents' religions anymore. They are claiming 2 or 3. The girl comes up to me in Atlanta, Georgia. She said, do you know what I am? I said, no, what are you? She said, I'm African Korean. I said, that's nice. She said, that's only half of it. I say, oh? She says, I'm a Baptist Buddhist. I told a friend of mine, a theologian up in Seattle, you know Seattle, where they all drink coffee. I told him that I had met a Baptist Buddhist in Atlanta. He said, that's impossible. There's no such thing as Baptist Buddhist. It's a contradiction in terms. Think again, Richard. I said, but she walks. My parents both recently died. My father died a year, almost a day before my mother died, inconsolable at his absence. I was cleaning their house the other day on 29th Avenue, the most prosaic street in San Francisco. You cannot imagine one more prosaic. But it occurred to me as I was in the backyard, what a remarkable neighborhood this is. My Mexican Catholic parents lived next door to Confucian Chinese, who lived next door to Iranian Muslims, who lived next door to American Baptists, who lived next door to Greek Orthodox, who lived next door to, I don't know who they were from San Diego. They believed in clean water and Mother Earth, who lived next door to Russian Jews, and so forth down the street. And I think in the history of the world, there have not been such neighborhoods. And they are here now. It was Karl Marx, the old commie himself, who said that the most extraordinary thing about California is that the world would find itself in California before it found itself anywhere else. He said with the gold rush in California would prove to be a more decisive event in the world, in world history, than the discovery of the Americas by Columbus. When Columbus comes upon the Americas, thinking that he's found India, anticipating a good curry meal, 2 races meet. But when gold is discovered in California, everyone comes. It has never happened before, Marx says. Chilean, Japanese, Chinese, Australian, Englishman, Scotsman, Italian, Frenchman, Mexican, Peruvian, all in one place looking for gold. I would like to tell you that it was a very happy time. They had a multicultural festival that week. 1 in 5 of those young men would die from that confrontation. But Marx said a great civilization would come out of that. He was referring to gridlock on the San Diego freeway. And now California has the 2nd highest miscegenation rate in the country. The highest is where? Hawaii. Something is moving west to east. By the time it gets to the editorial offices of the New York Times, you will know something has happened. The New York Times did a series on race in America, how it is lived, in which they managed to put themselves right at smack in the middle because it was all black and white. And then the New York Times did what it often does. It took a walk up Broadway to Columbia University and gave itself a Pulitzer Prize. No matter. I want to tell you that Brown may be our making. We are creating a global people in America, right in front of us. There is not a section of this country where this has not happened, where someone of one race will come up and introduce me to her granddaughter who is of another race or who looks nothing like her. It is happening all over this country, and no one speaks of it. The only vocabulary we have for it is the Canadian diversity. We are melting into each other, literally. This could be also, however, a very dangerous time, because as we go brown and then browner again, there are some people in this country who do not want to be brown, who want to clarify themselves. In some sense, religious fundamentalism is going to result from the mixing of religious experience. I want my religion clarified. I want my identity clarified. My name is John Walker Lindh. I grew up in Mill Valley, California. I ended up fighting for the Taliban. That's how you know me. What you don't know about me is that my father came out of the closet and became publicly homosexual and moved in with his lover in San Francisco. I dropped his name. I became John Walker. By the age of 14, I announced to my mother, my California mother, that I was sick of California. I was sick of the movies at the multiplex with monsters and screaming teenage girls. I was sick of the kids behind the school cafeteria smoking pot. I was sick of the neighborhoods that were completely empty of life, devoid of life, except for the Mexican with the leaf blower. By the age of 14, John Walker says that he wants to study Islam at the Islamic Center in Mill Valley, California. And his mother, like a good California mother, says, follow your bliss. So he studies there for 2 years, and by the age of 16 in many of these stories is crucial. By the age of 16, he tells his mother, I cannot be a Muslim in California. I need to be a Muslim among other Muslims. He goes to study in Yemen, and she loses touch with him. And the next thing she knows, he's on the evening news. And we are now, 4 or 5 years away from Columbine High School, and we adults in this room have still not connected the dots. Not a very hard thing to do, to connect dots. We have not done it. It was the grandson of an observant Jew who chose Hitler's birthday to go into the school cafeteria to shoot it up. Connect the dots. There are children in this country who are at war against their own brownness and will make you pay the price of that. Osama bin Laden is probably the best example I know of. The cosmopolite, upper-class Saudi, raised by a generous father to speak several languages. There are photographs of him as a young boy, the age of 13 or 14, standing outside the Beau Rivage Hotel in Geneva. He is smiling at us. He is wearing a silk suit. By the age of 16 already, he is beginning to retreat. He is beginning to pull away from cosmopolitan Geneva, wants nothing to do with you or with me, wants to live in a cave with people exactly like himself. Anyway, there I am at the school cafeteria. It is Diversity Week in America, usually early May. I'm enlisted to play Canada. I come to talk to the students about diversity. The headmaster says as we go into the school auditorium, I can hear the kids in the auditorium sounding like the pagans in the Colosseum in Rome. The schoolmaster says, oh, by the way, he says the kids hate the word diversity. Now he tells me. He said it's their parents who love it. The parents who love it. The kids hate it. They have it up to here with diversity. The best thing about Canadian multiculturalism is that it establishes the dignity of the individual. It says that this man here is a Greek Canadian. We will honor his Greekness. This woman here is a Ukrainian Canadian. We will honor her Ukrainianness. This woman here is a French Canadian. We will honor her Frenchness. Canada protects the I, the first person singular pronoun. But multiculturalism is not a very sexy idea. It is a very cool idea, because the only thing that Canada proposes in the new Canada of many races and many ethnicities is the slogan, diversity. Celebrate diversity. I remind you that etymologically, diversity comes from the word divide. So there I am in the classroom talking to kids about diversity and the Canadian mosaic, all these little pieces of glass frozen in time. And the Filipina over here is flirting with the African American over here, and they're making a date afterwards to go to have a Mexican lunch. Nothing melts in Canada. And isn't it curious that there is no Canadian food? I mean, when was the last time a friend of yours said, let's go to a Canadian restaurant tonight? What would they serve there? My good friend Robin McNeil tells me that there is a Canadian restaurant on the Upper West Side of New York, up by Lincoln Center. It's called Royal Mounted something or other. I said, Robin, what do they serve there? He says, pancakes, very large pancakes. I tell you, if we could combine the respect for the individual that Canada establishes, the cool respect for the individual, with the hot erotic knowledge of Mexico, if we could border ourselves with these two wisdoms, we could have a very sexy Iowa. Instead, by the time I got to Iowa on this book tour, I was 2 weeks too late. Iowa has just declared itself safe for the English language. English is now the official language of Iowa. That's a close one. So I was 2 weeks too late to tell Iowa what the British have been trying to tell America for over 200 years, that we do not speak English in this country. We speak a language closer to America, closer to American. In the 1850s already, the Britons were finding on the American tongue what they called Negroisms, a different cadence, African words, and American Indian words. And then come the grandmothers from Europe, Sicilians, Germans, Poles, and then come their valises full of new words that become part of our vocabulary. And then there is a war between Mexico and the United States, and we defeat Mexico, we take more than half of her territory, and we are not simply satisfied with the land, we want the words on the land. We want San Diego, we want La Jolla, we want Rio, we want Mesa, we want Arroyo. There is no one in this room who does not speak Spanish by virtue of speaking American. It is a brown tongue. I was 2 weeks too late. But now the kids in Tokyo, are coloring their hair green and blue. There is an explosion of color in the world. Kids are playing with color. Just playing with color. And in Singapore, whereas in the past Eurasians used to be called half-breeds, now they are called doubles. I'm speaking of this browning in the world, and I'm speaking of it specifically here in San Diego. But I'm not speaking of khaki. I'm speaking of brown. You are different from me, but in all the ways that you exist, I bump up against you and I take some of those ways with me. And I remind you at this dangerous moment, at this very dangerous moment, when the three great desert religions are at each other's throats, and we may be entering a century in which race is replaced by religion as the most important category, dividing us, that the three desert religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, are brown religions. They are brother religions. They have borrowed from one another. They have shaped one another. And it would do us all good to acknowledge that brownness. I was at the Census Bureau in Washington 2 weeks ago, and a number of statisticians predicted to me that the next census, the census of 2010, will be the last census in America that will use racial categories. We are so deep now into the age of brown. There are so many million children who will not define themselves as belonging to a group. Bravo. But I tell you, we are entering a dangerous time. We are entering a time when children will also not want to be brown. And I know because I have interviewed them. I did a piece must have been about 8 years ago for a German magazine on skinheads. Interesting subject, skinheads. You should go up to meet them in Idaho. How they live on their little plot of ground, and they will cede to you Los Angeles and Detroit and New York, but do not stick your big Mexican nose into their little plot of ground, or they will blow your head off. But it was here in San Diego, or near San Diego in El Cajon, one day. I was interviewing a minor official of the KKK. This was not a major wizard. He may be here this evening for all I know. I was interviewing him with that good German. He was telling me all the reasons why we have to keep Mexico at bay, keep Tijuana from slipping across the line. And it came to be lunchtime, and I had all these Deutschmarks in my pocket. The euro had not been invented yet. And my mother always used to say, take a skinhead out to lunch. There was only the question, what does a skinhead eat? I thought maybe he eats meat. I said, you'd like to go to lunch? And I thought maybe he eats beef. Do you want a burger? I said. He said, no, this is a true story. You can believe it or not. I do not care. He said, no, I do not want a burger. I like Mexican food. I said, are you crazy? You like Mexican food? He said, yeah, big deal. I like Mexican food. I said, that is a big deal. I said, have you ever looked inside a burrito? Do you know what's going on inside a burrito? There's an Indian making love to a Spaniard inside a burrito, and sometimes an African comes in and it's a threesome. Thank you very much.